Matter podcast, where we talk about how what you consume, from food to drugs and ideas, influences who you become. I'm your host, Nick Jikomis, and I have a background in academic science, independent research, and writing, and I'm the creator of the Mind to Matter podcast and Substack page. I got a PhD in neuroscience from Harvard University, where I studied the neurobiology of feeding behavior, and before that, I studied evolutionary genetics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. On normal episodes of the podcast, I talk mainly with scientists, academics, and other experts about topics that interest me as a biologist, ranging from neuroscience to metabolism, evolution, animal behavior, and the effects of drug, food, and biotechnology. This episode is part of a special sub-series where I talk to independent scholars who are often not affiliated with major institutions like universities, but who I believe have interesting perspectives. These conversations are often more multidisciplinary in nature, connecting my areas of scientific interest with subjects spanning social psychology, culture, religion, history, and the rise and fall of civilizations, areas which may sometimes be more taboo, controversial, or outside the Overton window of popular discourse. These episodes are available in full to paid subscribers on the Mind to Matter Substack page or my YouTube channel. If you're hearing this version, you will hear the beginning portion of the episode, but must become a paid subscriber to hear the full version. If a paid subscription is not in the cards for you, simply head over to the Mind and Matter Substack page at mindandmatter.substack.com, subscribe to my free weekly newsletter, and send me a message, and I'll provide you with a complimentary subscription. And with that, enjoy the episode. This episode is supported in part by Athletic Greens. Their main product, AG1, is a comprehensive and convenient daily nutrition product containing 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients with less than 1 gram of sugar per serving, no nasty chemicals or artificial anything. It's gluten and dairy free and compatible with paleo, vegan, vegetarian, and ketogenic diets. AG1 is a quick and convenient way to supplement your diet to help ensure your body is getting the nutrients it needs. It comes in powder form, and you can mix it in water and drink it, or you can put it into a smoothie or a shake or something like that. I mix it into water and drink it, and it's super convenient. If you go to athleticgreens.com/mindandmatter, Athletic Greens will give you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Their vitamin D product comes in tincture form, so you just take 1 drop each day. A large fraction of the population is actually vitamin D deficient, especially in winter months when we get less sun exposure, and vitamin D is super important for the proper function of the immune system and for a variety of other things. So visit athleticgreens.com/mindandmatter or click the link in the episode description. You'll get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D with your first purchase.
Thank you for having me, Nick. It's an honor. Thank you.
Can you just tell everyone a little bit about, who you are, what your background is?
So my background is I was a guy who had absolutely no interest in anything to do with diets. I grew up with a mother who was overweight, who went through Weight Watchers, and I watched her weight yo-yo over the years. And I came to the conclusion that the whole diet thing was kind of baloney. And I figured that if I followed the expert advice, which was mainly the dietary guidelines, that I would be just fine. I was a real science nerd as a kid. When I had to study for the AP Bio class, I just read the textbook the night before the final exam, and that was all I needed to do. And I, aced it. I had a real fascination with biology. So I knew enough about evolutionary history never to really buy into the saturated fat is bad, mantra, just because I understood the biology and the history of it. But that said, if you're in the modern food environment, unless you go out of your way to eat a lot of saturated fat, you don't eat a lot of saturated fat. So
can you actually expand on that a little bit? What do you mean you knew about the evolutionary history and what that meant for saturated fat consumption?
Well, I knew that humans evolved eating a lot of animal fat, right, and dairy fat, and that these were consistent and widespread parts of human diets all over the world. So I found it just unlikely, without knowing anything about the biochemistry of the epidemiology. It just struck me as something that was, it didn't make sense, right? Why would we eat something for so long that was bad for us.
Yeah, there's actually, I think, a very important lesson lurking in what you just said, which is you can actually make I don't even want to say educated guesses. You can sort of know things that are very likely or very unlikely to be true about your own body by understanding the evolutionary history of our species, even if you don't know very much about the mechanistic details by which certain processes operate.
Yeah, you can definitely. You can also make some horrible mistakes.
Yeah, yeah.
um, so anyway, I professionally, I've am self-taught in technology and finance and found myself first a trader at a hedge fund and then ultimately the chief technology officer of a hedge fund and in charge of all their risk systems and accounting systems and a lot of other stuff. But then I started getting these various different, at the time, seemingly unrelated illnesses. And ultimately, I was able, through revisiting my aversion to diet and doing a little bit of research, figuring out that if I changed my diet in a more evolutionarily consistent manner, that all of my illnesses went away, including things that it never would have occurred to me were related to diet.
Do you mind sharing what some of those issues were?
Well, sure. I had a history of allergies in my family. Was susceptible to sunburn. I mean, you're looking at me. That won't come as a surprise to you. Blonde and blue eyes for the podcast listeners out there. Um, I started getting these intestinal problems. I was hospitalized a couple of times because I was vomiting blood.
Hmm.
Um, and they weren't able to figure out what was going on with that. I started breaking a lot of bones. I was hospitalized for what they initially thought was a stroke when I was 38 years old. Um, I got acute diverticulitis when I was 40 years old and was hospitalized a number of times for that and ultimately had to have a colon resection. And a lot of it, I gained the classic gained a pound a year, after my 20s, which I thought was just normal.
Yeah, yeah.
And a lot of this stuff was just stuff that I attributed to aging. And then when I actually, you know, fixed my diet and kind of better looking than smart, as they say, the first intervention that I tried was cutting seed oils out of my diet.
Mhm.
And everything else that I learned followed from that.
Why was that? Why was it the first intervention? How did you happen upon that as a potential strategy?
I had been reading Stefan Guyenet's blog back in 2009. And I got turned on to that because I had an interest in the time at barefoot running. And one of the guys I knew turned me on to his malocclusion series, right? Which is malocclusion is the fact that your teeth don't fit correctly into your jaw. And this is again something that I thought was genetic. I had bad teeth. My mother had bad teeth. My grandmother had bad teeth. Must be genetic. And Stefan's posts were definitive in convincing me that it was clearly the result of a bad diet.
Hmm.
And that opened up my mind to the fact that diet could have a huge impact on your health, because one of the banes of my existence is seeing the dentist, which I did a lot of as a kid. I had 8 teeth pulled out and some number of cavities, which I long ago lost count of. Plus, I had a dentist who was a smoker, so his fingers tasted like cigarette butts. It was disgusting. So I have lots of bad memories of the dentist. So realizing and I had, at this point, this was when I was 42 years old. I had cut sugar out of my diet when I was 18 or 19 because of a dentist who told me that if I
Hmm.
didn't want to see the dentist anymore, all I had to do was stop eating sugar. So I did. And he was right. And since, I'm now 18 to 56, which is how old I am, I've had one tiny cavity in all of those years after cutting sugar out of my diet. So I was open to the idea that having a dietary change could have a major impact on your health. I
Mhm.
just didn't really know enough about it to do anything intelligent. So Stefan had a post about skin health and cancer and seed oils and dietary fats that I found really interesting. And that was when, obviously my father's had skin cancer, my mother's had skin cancer. It's a thing in my family. So one day I walked down to the end, I was at work and I walked down to the end of the salad bar and looked at these squeeze bottles of various different salad dressings and thought to myself, that's got to be the worst, cheapest oils known to man to make it into this place. And right then I decided to stop eating seed oils and see what happened. And at that point I had, this was 2 years after my colon resection. So at that point I'd had irritable bowel disease for 16 years consistently.
Mhm.
I used to have to travel around with a roll of toilet paper and a backpack just in case of an emergency. And that resolved in 2 days. 2 days. And I posted on my blog the email that I sent to Stefan DNA after that. He was very helpful in helping me get started in what to learn about this. And I was like, I can't believe this. This is just 16 years seriously, and it resolves in 2 days.
And it
So
stayed that way afterwards?
yeah, well, I can, I mean, I'm a self-taught engineer, so I take very little for granted. I did a lot of experimenting with adding foods in, taking foods back out, seeing which foods and which combination of foods would cause the symptoms of my irritable bowel disease. For me, it's seed oils, wheat, and chili peppers.
Hmm.
I love chili peppers. Just thinking about them makes my mouth water. But that combination will put me into agony in a very short term. So things like breaded chicken wings are just catastrophe for me.
Mhm.
Now, if I mix the ingredients around, if they're fried in something other than seed oils or baked or whatever, and they're not too spicy, then I'm fine with them. But I
Hmm.
did a lot of experimenting to figure out what I couldn't eat,
Yeah.
and some of it was accidental. I discovered soybean oil had wheat in it. Who would think?
Mm. Yeah.
Because I went to the Whole Foods and bought one of their little trays of sushi and ate it. And on the way out to the car, I got these massive stomach cramps, like bent over in the parking lot stomach cramps. And I went back in, got the thing out of the garbage can, read the ingredients, and discovered that there was wheat in the soybean oil. You know, who
Huh.
knew?
Yeah. And so, very briefly, just for those who don't know, what are seed oils?
Seed oils are fats that are derived from seeds. Right? Seems a little simplistic. I use that term and it's used in nutrition because it's distinct from vegetable oils, which include things that are oils made from the fruit of a plant. So an
Mhm.
olive has a pit, which is the seed, and then it has the soft part surrounding it, which is the fruit. Traditionally, an olive was made by squeezing the fruit so that the oil would come out, right?
Mhm.
Avocados are similar. There are some caveats in there, and I'm going to leave a lot of
Yeah.
caveats as we go through this stuff just to try and keep the message a little
Yeah. Yeah.
simple and
But in
more
everyday,
concise.
in every, like when everyday people hear vegetable oil, that typically does refer to seed oils.
Although they'd include olive oil in that, and I would
Yep.
not. Or
Yep.
they'd include coconut oil
Yep.
in that, which I would not.
And what would be like, so basically the question is, why don't you include those things together? What is it about their composition that distinguishes what you call seed oils from some of these others?
So the fatty acid composition of these oils is what's significant.
Mm-hmm.
And oils that come from fruits and tropical oils tend to have a very different fatty acid composition than seed oils. You know, and this is true in animals as well. So, for instance, fish that live in more northerly waters where it's colder tend to have more polyunsaturated fat in their flesh than fish that live in warmer waters. And the reason is saturated fats solidify and polyunsaturated fats do not. So, in theory, if you took a salmon or not a salmon, but if you took a tropical fish
Hmm.
and put it in cold water, it would be unable to move because the membranes of its cells would lose their elasticity and the protein pumps in the cells would stop being able to function at the rate that the animal required.
Hmm.
So it would, and in bacteria, we see this. Bacteria, depending on the ambient temperature, will rapidly alter the fatty acid composition of their membranes so that they continue to function in a consistent way.
Yeah. Yeah. So the membrane needs a certain level of elasticity to for the biomechanics of all the stuff in the membrane to work, basically.
Elasticity and activity. A
Hmm.
lot of the pumps in the membranes that are embedded in the membranes actually are driven by the Brownian action of the fatty acid molecules themselves,
Hmm.
which is something I only learned recently. I interviewed Tony Hulbert, who's a zoologist and an expert on animal membranes, and he explained that you can take, for instance, a sodium pump out of one organism where it runs at a certain rate, put it in another organism with a different fatty acid composition in the membranes, and it'll run at the rate of that organism based on the fats that are in the membranes.
Oh, wow. Interesting. And so polyunsaturated fats, these are fatty acids with multiple double bonds, hence the name polyunsaturated. Um, these are in all sorts of foods. Seed oils are a big example. How
All
would it,
foods,
yeah, yeah,
essentially all
I mean,
foods.
yeah, the vast majority. How would a typical mainstream American physician trained at an American university or, a member of the American Heart Association, how would they talk about polyunsaturated fats and human health today?
Oh, they would tell you that they're great for you.
Because what would be the reasoning there?
And the reasoning, well, specifically the AH, the American Heart Association, came up with a hypothesis back in the 1950s. Well, let me rephrase that. They observed that if you fed people or animals omega-6 fatty acids, that it would drive their cholesterol down. And they had a hypothesis that cholesterol is what drove heart disease, which had just become a major problem in the United States. And their idea was that if you took increasing amounts of omega-6 fats, this would lower your cholesterol and thereby lower your rates of heart disease, right? That message has been consistently promulgated by the American Heart Association and by the medical establishment ever since the late 1950s. Um,
Okay, so the basic idea is serum cholesterol levels are bad if they get too high because we
right.
think that's what's primarily driving cardiovascular disease. Eating polyunsaturated fats will bring those numbers down. It does, in fact, do that. And therefore, eating them is good and heart healthy. And that's why you see things like the American Heart Association Heart Healthy check mark on so many
Corn
boxes of
oil.
foods that have
Yeah,
polyunsaturated fats.
that's right. That's right. And the problem with that messaging is that the American Heart Association went to great effort to try and prove experimentally that that was the case. Now, I mean, you have to understand that they're prescribing this as a drug, right? I mean, we now have refined fish oil products that are prescribed as drugs by physicians to prevent cardiovascular disease. The American Heart Association, starting in the late 1950s, and some of the fellows associated with it tried to demonstrate that this change would prove beneficial for cardiovascular disease, and they were unable to do so. Um, all the longer term attempts, all of their attempts except for one, showed that consuming more seed oils resulted in higher levels of cardiovascular disease. The one that was neutral was too short term to show any effect at all. So unfortunately, they never came around and said, okay, we tried this and it didn't work. They kind of changed their message to say, okay, well, polyunsaturated fats in general are good for you. And by that, they included omega-3 fats in fish oil, right? Which is true. Unfortunately, that's not what people eat. The
Mm-hmm.
average American eats a 20 to 30 to 1 ratio of omega-6 to
Mm-hmm.
omega-3 fats.
And that's just a natural consequence of the fact that seed oils and other processed foods contain primarily omega 6 food.